I love it. You know, thank you. Whoever did that tapping, I appreciate that. You guys can settle yourselves. You're going to have many more minutes to talk, but right now we need you to be quiet. Hi, my name's Daley, and I am part of the leadership crew of this breakfast, and we are really, really glad you're here. And I think with that, Mr. Mike is going to come on up and get us ready.
Yep. Good morning.
Mike, are we all done with food? Done? Are we done with the food?
Yes.
Seconds, thirds, anybody? Okay.
Last call?
Last call.
Hey, Brett, that was a great breakfast.
So it gives me great pleasure to introduce somebody that you all know. We welcome back Mark. Mark and I go back decades, I would say. We were in a Bible study together for 14 years with 6 other couples. Mark didn't seem to dominate those at all. He's laid back in the background and let us flounder. And you don't know how long I've tried to get Mark here. It was a work in progress and a labor of love to connect with him again once he was back from Pasadena. I just want to read just a little overly, or in the leaf of one of his books, Loving Your Neighbor. I just thought it was really apropos for today. Quoting inside here, it says, "Too often we look at people, we see problems or inconveniences on one hand, and ways we'll get taken advantage of on the other. When we begin to see others with eyes of Jesus, the stage is set, not only for our own heart change, but for the change of the world where life and justice flourish." So let us welcome Mark.
Hey everyone, it's wonderful to be here and great to see so many familiar faces as well as some that I don't know, and so I am just delighted to be here. It was never a lack of desire to be here that caused the delay, more a desire to perpetuate a ministry of floundering that we had going for a while. But I am very glad to be here, and there were just a lot of other things going on. So. Let me just give you a little bit, for those who have known our family, just a tiny bit of background. So we were in Pasadena for 10 years, and I finished as the president of Fuller a year ago in January, and then we moved back, and then I continued working for Fuller full-time for the next 6 months. Then I was officially done at the end of June last year. And I've been mostly engaged in writing and doing more speaking in various places than I was really kind of anticipating doing. And there's a couple of larger projects that I've been involved in that have taken really quite a lot of time. So I'm hoping that actually that greater measure of retirement will still emerge. And that when some of these projects fall away, it'll feel a little bit more like I'm in a new season. Our boys are doing well. Peter is in Los Angeles doing work as an independent recording engineer in music and in film and in television, which has turned out to be a really great thing for him. And Sam, our younger son, is living in San Luis Obispo, newly engaged, and will probably get married sometime in the fall. So we're looking forward to seeing how all of those chapters for them unfold. Janet and I are happy to be back in the Bay Area, and the mildness of the temperatures especially suit Janet very nicely with her Scottishness. This feels more like her body finding the right context. So what I'd like to spend some time talking about this morning comes really out of, I hope really a lifetime in a way of meditating on the Gospel of Matthew, which has continued for a whole variety of reasons to be, of the 4 Gospels, it's the one that I've definitely spent the most time in. And it partly has to do with the fact that I was raised in a home where my dad was a scientist and an inventor, and a very much a man of a modernist in every way. And he saved certain neck veins for the discussion of religion because he really wanted his 2 cents to have as little to do with religion as possible. And his critique, which was pretty profound and plain, actually easily proven on any given day, is that what religious people do, what Christian religious people do especially, he would argue, is that they take great things and make them very small. And that is to say, you take some great idea, like there is a God, and it all gets reduced in some circles to a very myopic little conversation about exactly some aspect or detail or nuance of God's being or God's activity that ends up dividing people, causing wars, brutalizing people in ways that can be really damaging. Or you take something like the mystery of being a human being, and under certain kinds of dogma of Christian faith can somehow end up becoming that a human being is only a moral agent, and the only thing that matters is whether you've done, quote, the right thing or whether you've done the wrong thing. And all of this was just evidence of saying, if you want a life of the mind, if you want a life that is capacious in its range of interests and its engagement with the world and its perspective, then do everything you can to avoid religion. So when I started reading the New Testament as I was a freshman in college, I was just really shocked at how much Jesus and my dad had in common. That was the first thing that struck me, because in fact Jesus, there's a whole stream of Jesus' teaching that really is about these two great themes of taking great things and making them small. And whether he was talking to religious authorities or others, it was a shrinkage process that he was trying to obviously be the antidote for. So that was a huge shock to me, and I love needling him, saying, "Dad, you really should read the New Testament more. You might like Jesus." And then I discovered really Jesus' antidote to this small making, which was not the avoidance of religion, although there is a danger in religion. But really, instead, his offering was discover and live into life in the kingdom of God, which is the thing that cracks open reality, that cracks open all dimensions of reality, the whole of both the cosmic world, subatomic world, and the world of what philosophers sometimes call the world of middle-sized objects, like being in a room at a table with friends. And everything is changed by this reality of what Jesus is portraying in the Gospels about the kingdom. So I come to faith in Christ. I didn't have any Christian friends. I wasn't in a context where that was in any way a part of the world that I was living in. And and it was an amazing transformation. And my anxiety was really, what will happen when I have to think about the meaning of faith in relationship to other people? Because it was clear that was what, not meaning other people that are not in the church, I meant meaning in the church. So it's always been odd, given that beginning, it's always been odd to me that I ended up becoming a Christian. Very surprising that I ended up becoming a pastor. Very surprising that I ended up becoming the president of a theological seminary that produces pastors. So, there's been a lot of torque and surprise in the system. But each step along the way, I keep being surprised and grateful for God's faithfulness. So the Gospel of Matthew was the first gospel that I read, and there was something, again, with no knowledge whatsoever of the New Testament. I just picked up a copy of the New Testament and started reading through the Gospels, and it was the Gospel of Matthew that first snagged me, because it was literally the first one that I read, but also something about it really caught my attention and my imagination. So I would just encourage you to never be more than, I've jokingly said, never more than 5 minutes from rereading one of the Gospels, because there's something so redefining about it and easily lost. So it comes and it goes and it comes and it goes, and to stay proximate to it is really critical. So I wanted to reflect with you a little bit this morning on one part of the Gospel of Matthew, because I think it tees up things that will be, have been and will be very, very important to all of us. So In Matthew's gospel, which I tend to think of as a gospel of surprise, that it's a gospel that on the one hand says the most about the significance of what God has done in Israel's life. It quotes the Old Testament the most. It's the most authenticating line of continuity of any of the four gospels. Whereas the other gospels are a little bit more about discontinuity. Matthew is really about continuity. How does Jesus connect with the Old Testament? And so there's that, which is very traditional. On the other hand, it is a gospel of surprise and shock. And over again, you open up the first part of Matthew and you're into only the first early verses with the genealogy, which often people just skip over, but which is really quite an amazing shockwave, because you're only just into those first verses and suddenly there's the names of really unexpected women, 4 unexpected women who would not be thought to be belonging in the genealogy of the Son of God, the son of Abraham, the son of David, and the Messiah. Just this extreme shock. And then, oh, by the way, this is all about Joseph, and Joseph, technically speaking, has nothing to do with the birth narrative, which then happens in the second half of Matthew 1. And so it goes over and over and over again through the Gospel of Matthew. By the time we get to chapter 5, which is the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, it's these 3 chapters where Jesus is giving his first of 5 bodies of teaching that happen in the Gospel of Matthew. And in 5 to 7, he's basically laying out a portrait of what life in the kingdom is meant to look like. And it reorders power, it reorders relationships, it reorders values, it reorders habits of life. It calls us to a new way of being and acting in the world. And then at the very end, Jesus offers this well-known parable about building your house on rock and not on sand. And it goes like this. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So Jesus comes to the end of this extraordinary block of teaching, 5 to 7, and then says, now, what I don't want is you to stand at the door, as it were, and say, good sermon, pastor. What I actually want is changed lives, and it will change because of actually living what I've just been teaching you, not just affirming it, not saying amen, not saying, we should really promote this, we should create pamphlets and distribute this in some sort of way. No, none of that. It's just a sense of doing the truth. If you build your house on rock, it's not by confessing, it's by doing the truth. That is a theme that runs through Matthew and the other Gospels, but particularly in Matthew, in a way that links what we believe and what we do in really, really strong ways. And in fact, when the caveat is given just after that, when Jesus says, when it is said that people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught as one who had I'm probably not speaking loudly enough. Are you hearing me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He taught them as one who had authority and not like the scribes and Pharisees. That word in Matthew's gospel, authority, is used in very significant moments from the beginning of the gospel all the way to the end. And it always is about this junction between Jesus being someone who had authority because he both said the truth and did the truth. And his authority lie in that combination. So the power of the witness of Jesus was not just the power to heal and do many remarkable things, but it was also this connectedness between what we say and what we do. Max Dupree, who was the head of the Herman Miller Company for many years and a former chair of Fuller Seminary's board, wrote a book called Zoe, which was about the dramatic premature birth of his little granddaughter Zoe, who weighed 1 pound 6 ounces at the time of her birth. And he rushed to the hospital to help his daughter. And the head nurse said, what you need to do, Max, is that you need to come every day and you need to stick your hands as gently as you can in through the sides of the incubator. She'll be here for months while this process of continued growth needs to occur. And what you need to do is put your hands inside her body, stroke her very, very gently, and tell her again and again how much you love her. Because what she needs more than anything else is to be able to connect your voice to your touch. Now, Max uses this to describe aspects of leadership in particular, and in any role of leadership, how critical it is that the leader be a person for whom what we say and what we do are really convergent and not colliding. But I would suggest that that's also a remarkable summary of what Jesus is saying here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Because what will be astonishing about the church's life in the world is if the church both confesses and lives the truth. Now, these are obvious statements, like probably no one in the room has failed to hear that kind of an expression or something like that for years. But it actually is the most raw data that most people in the world will ever receive, is whether or not Christian people have both professed the truth and done the truth. And then seamlessly, as Jesus says this at the end of 7, then in the beginning of 8, you begin into a period in chapters 8 and 9 where Jesus performs 9 miracles. And in the context of these 9 miracles, important things are said, and then eventually he has his next main body of teaching, which is in chapter 10. So I want to just take a little bit of time to look at chapter 8 at the beginning, because that's where Jesus is faced with the question, will you say the truth and do it, or will you just say the truth? So he has said in the Sermon on the Mount that our love needs to exceed the scribes and Pharisees. He said in the Sermon on the Mount that, in fact, it's our righteousness needs to exceed that, and that we are meant to be people who imitate this entirely new quality of life, and that we are meant to love not only those who love us, but those who may not like us, and in fact, those who may be our enemies. So listen to this. It just seamlessly moves in this direction. When Jesus came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him, and behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed, and Jesus said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. Now, it was a truism of daily life in that era, of course, that to be a pure Jewish person and to be a pure Jewish teacher authority, which Jesus was clearly seen as, you would needed to avoid anything that would cause you to be ritually impure. And the icon of that, in some ways, especially in the Gospels, is the icon of the leper, the person whose condition makes them dangerous, threatening, and purifying. That is, they will make other people impure. So their rhythm of life was to walk through the world saying, unclean, 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 in order to keep people away, right? And here this leper does not say unclean. He himself expresses extraordinary courage. He cries out in the crowd as a leper that everyone would have understood and known as a leper. If you choose, you could make me clean. It's an amazing act of courage on his own part to actually fully declare that. And then Jesus, it's like, so are you going to live the truth or are you not going to live the truth? Are you going to do the truth that you've just been teaching or not? Jesus knew the boundaries that everyone was watching for, were that he would maintain distance from the man. But instead, of course, he touches him and he heals him. And the question that it raises in my mind is, what do we do with people who stain us? We don't really necessarily have a world in which there's a lot of people with leprosy in our daily lives. But we do live in a culture where there's all kinds of ways that culture continues to have boundaries and rules and regulations about who's acceptable, who's appropriate, who's knowable, who's someone that we should approach and be maybe even associated with. In this context, Jesus just shatters all of those expectations in such an incredible way. I mean, the social force of this was remarkable. There was a woman who used to attend First Pres who was a socialite in San Francisco, and she would come over from San Francisco every Sunday morning. And she was, by this stage, a single woman in her 60s-ish, I would think. And she would come and she would park. This is in the days, so it was more than 20 years ago when there was still a parking lot out here. She would come early so that she could park in one of the places closest to the church because she wanted to avoid anyone that she might encounter otherwise on Telegraph Avenue or really anywhere else around. So she confessed this to me one day and said, I've been coming to this church, I've been hearing the messages. I realize that probably more is expected of me than this, but I just feel so much more comfortable just trying to have nothing to do with people that are on the street. So I said, well, that's an understandable feeling. I get that, but I think more is expected of you. And so I don't know how you're going to sort of deal with that, but that is part of it. And coming to church in Berkeley is a great opportunity to be able to practice that. And so she and I had this kind of repartee going on for a while about what she was going to do. And then I noticed that she was not in her usual place at her usual time, because she had a very specific pattern of how she did these things. And so I talked to her after the service when she had appeared, and she said, I've been praying about this for a really long time. I said, I know, we've been talking about it. She said, so I decided I was going to park over by People's Park, and I was going to walk around People's Park, and then I was going to walk up Telegraph Avenue, and then I was going to come to church. So she said, I haven't told you this, but I've actually been practicing doing that. And I'm sort of getting it. I'm feeling the vibe in a way that is different than I had expected. I said, that's interesting. She said, well, but what happened today was quite different. So I did that, and there was a program at the time that we had that you could buy food chips that you could give to people that would allow them to actually go to various places, restaurants, and get a meal. So she said, I've been using those. So I would have those in my hand, and I'd walk around People's Park, and I'd walk up Telegraph Avenue and sort of flip one of these if somebody was calling out for some money or whatever. I would just give them one of these, but I wouldn't ever engage with them. I usually just literally, they were in my hand, and I would just kind of go like that. So she said, but today what was different is that I was doing that, and I had decided that I was going to take another step cut. I felt like I wanted to give some money this time, and I was taking the risk of not controlling it. I'll just give the money away, and I feel like that was going to be substantial. So she said I didn't want to give less than $5, and I was inclined to want to give 10 because I felt like that would be harder for me to give $10 than to give 5, and that felt like it was an important step. So she said, so I was walking along the street, and I had 3 $10 bills in my hand, and I was prepared to give them away as I walked up Telegraph. And she said I did the first one and the second one, and then I gave 10 to the third person as well. And then all of a sudden, I just walked on. I didn't in any case engage them in any way, but I just walked on. And then suddenly, this voice was saying, "Hey!" And in the context of that, I turned around, and here was this guy who then just gave me this enormous bear hug. It was the third person, just this enormous bear hug. And she said, "Are we done?" And he said, "Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you." She said, "Good, well, I hope you can put it to good use," and went on to church. Then she said, "You might have seen me, I didn't get up from church after about 5 or 10 minutes, and I felt like, how did I dare do that? I gave this money, I don't even know this person's name. I've had no engagement." And so she decided, I can't sing this song, whatever it was that we were singing, like "This Is My Father's World" or something like that. And she said, so I just walked back to Telegraph, and I found him, and I said, "Hi, this is who I am," and he introduced himself, and we had about a 5-minute conversation. And I said, "Well, thank you. I didn't want to just give you money." So she said, so I feel like I'm on a new road for me that is like not a road that I've ever wanted. In fact, I've studiously avoided it in any way. It unfolds in her life to have a revolutionary impact, and it leads her to make many, far more consequential decisions than the ones I've just shared. But it all began in those moments, those flashes, where you either do something or you don't do something. You either engage or you don't engage. You either see and hear or you don't see and you don't hear, or you reject what you're seeing or hearing. In Jesus' context with this leper, the question that it raises in a society with lots of people that we are taught and told we should not associate with. Now this crosses political lines, it crosses gender lines, it crosses racial lines, it crosses ethnic lines, it crosses economic lines. There's all kinds of ways in which we have divided and subdivided how we should actually make decisions about who we consider safe and how it is that we're going to engage them. Did you know, for example, maybe I showed this in the lecture that I gave a few weeks ago, that the brain registers every 34 milliseconds. It's kind of like a scan that's going on about whether someone or something is dangerous. In 1/34th of a millisecond, the initial indication is this or isn't this person or this thing that's happening dangerous is registered. By 110 to 20 milliseconds, the body has actually already received the information of that first insight and then is now calibrating to what degree of danger is it. So it's not just danger, but it's actually then degree of danger, which then causes us to respond in certain ways. So imagine becoming a person who was raised, as Jesus would have been, to have had no contact with lepers, and whose brain, 1/34th of a second, has been groomed to see a leper as a person that needs to be avoided at all costs. What does it take for our brains, which is partly to say our hearts, which is partly to say our whole perception of reality, to be revolutionized enough that we could actually begin to see and engage the world? That book, The Dangerous Act of Loving Your Neighbor, Seeing Others Through the Eyes of Jesus, is a book that I wrote while I was here. And it was really a book that came out of realizing that perception is one of the hardest things to change, especially if perception is related to actually engaging. That combination in whatever settings. So I think of times when I've been in political settings where clearly the political divide between various people right now is exceptionally high and often very exceptionally hostile. Jesus just doesn't see the world in that way. It's like Jesus doesn't see with a map of geography and nationhood either. He doesn't look at us. He doesn't look at the people that are around him in those same categories. That is a revolutionary fact. And we can say, well, yeah, but I'm not Jesus. Touche. Good to know. Really, really good to know. I encourage you to say that to yourself. I'm not Jesus. Okay? So that's a great bit of news. But yes, but we are called to follow him. We are called to become imitators of him. We're called to actually enter into these spheres that for this morning I'm thinking of in terms of courage and risk. How do we develop deliberately as a habit of life a new set of perceptions, a new set of engagements? And we don't have to start in the deepest end of the pool. We don't have to start with loving enemies. How about just genuinely loving people that are annoying? Do you know any annoying people? Are they here this morning? Did you sleep with them last night? Do they live in your house? Are they on your street? Are they away at college? Etc. These are all things that are part of it. Annoying, really irritating, a little more claw action there. The world would be a different place if we really had the capacity to readily, warmly love across even irritation and annoyance. All of this is a ramp into developing capacities to see and perceive and engage in ways that will require courage beyond our normal bounds and risk beyond our normal comfort level to actually move into engagement with people that we are not sure we want to be around. I remember one time being in O'Hare, and it was one of those terrible nightmares where everybody is in one space and there's no places to sit, and the plane is delayed and you don't know how many hours. and everybody's now in line either to try to change their flights or to get fast food, and there was a fast food restaurant there, and I was really hungry, and so I jumped and gotten into the line early, and then sat down on the edge of the moving sidewalk, sort of on that little edge on the outside of the sidewalk like this. And I was watching this guy in line at this Burger King, and he was just hitting on all the younger women that were passing by. And I just thought in my deeply self-righteous heart, what a jerk. Like leave them alone. They're just like trying to cope with the same mess you are. But this kept happening. And then I sort of lost track of the story, and I was doing more people watching, looking at whatever else was going on. And all of a sudden I realized that the guy in line came and sat down right here. Next to the moving sidewalk. He was like, my buddy, right here. And I said, so is that your usual success rate? And he said, what? I said, like with the young women that were going by, he goes, oh yeah, today was a bad day. It was a real bad day. Usually, I was sort of off my game. I forgot about these lines, and then he gave them to me as tips in case I needed them. He said, thanks, that's good input. I'll remember that. So then we just started chatting, the usual stuff. Where are you going? What are you doing? I'm flying to Vegas. Why are you flying to Vegas? Because I have a new job there. I said, well, so that must be exciting. He said, well, it should have been exciting, but in fact today was actually supposed to be my wedding day, but my fiance was killed in a car accident 3 weeks ago. And so this was actually meant to be the morning that we would get married, and then we would be flying together to Las Vegas to start this new chapter of life, but all that's done. I just have to get out of here. I said, out of where? Obviously out of here, but you mean out of Chicago? He goes, yeah, but also my family. I said, but they've been supportive in this loss of your fiance. No, they haven't been supportive. They didn't really like her, and frankly, I think, though they wouldn't say it, I think they were just relieved that she was out of the picture. I said, so you're flying from Chicago to Vegas. What's your work? I'm going to be a cop. Got it, you're going to be a cop in Las Vegas. And you don't know anyone, and you're really deeply in grief and in anger, really, not only in the loss of your fiance, but also in the family stuff and everything else. And on it went, and on it went, and we had many hours of additional conversation, and we talked about all kinds of different things. In the end, I happened to know some people in Las Vegas that I could connect him with, because as he kept saying, I know no one there. They met him at the airport. They helped him with some of those initial months, about 6 months. They followed and tried to do whatever they could to just help him get established. And I don't know really what happens to his story, but what I do know is that in that moment, Mark Labberton, left to his own devices in his unchanged brain and self-righteous attitude toward the guy who's hitting on the chicks in line, would not have engaged the guy that was sitting next to me. But over time, by the grace of God, in a small way, no heroism here, just ordinary humanity, just engaging with this human being that's sitting next to me. And an entry point that I wouldn't normally use of, is that your usual success rate? That's not my usual opening line in getting acquainted with a stranger. But it led to this whole unfurling of something that was so much bigger and more beautiful and more problematic than anything to do with the guy hitting on the chicks in line, which could have just been a showstopper, right? Kind of like, ugh, whatever. Instead, he actually became not only a human being, but a human being in a really complex and difficult time, where without any great exercise of anything on my part, just trying to be present to him in that moment was really a significant thing to him. And he wrote to me twice to say how grateful he was for my friends. I said, yeah, I'm really grateful for my friends too, and they are the right people to be there. How did all that happen? Just because of a tiny little thing that felt like, to me, it grows out of the impact of a text like this in Matthew 8, of just this tiny gesture. I can't heal his pain and suffering, but I can actually at least be a listening ear at a moment of great difficulty. And exercise the capacity to move across my own internal lines. Now this intensifies in the next section of Matthew 8, which I'll quickly jump onto and then we'll be done. In the next miracle of these 9 is this. It starts at verse 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you even come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." And when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In what place will there be weeping and gnashing of teeth?" And to the centurion, Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you as you have believed." And the servant was healed at that very moment. So, again, the first section is really what you do about people who might, quote, stain you, who are people that you're in some way creating lines of distance from. This one is really more about what do you do about the enemy. The centurion really was an embodiment of the enemy, the oppressive regime of Rome that dominated everything about Israel's life. The centurion that represented everything about that kind of brutal power. And in the context of that, it's the centurion who comes to Jesus, who makes a simple offering of an unexpected faith as a Gentile, completely outside Israel's life, makes a statement of faith that causes Jesus to stop the whole action and say, are we all paying attention to what just happened here? This person's faith from the enemy is the one who has expressed faith so noteworthy that in fact, he says, I have not seen faith like this in all of Israel. And in fact, because of this kind of faith, there will be many, many, many who will come from north, south, east, and west, namely, meaning outside Israel. There'll be many Gentiles who will feast at the table in the kingdom of God, while many that presume by birth that they're going to be found in the kingdom of God will actually be found in the outer darkness. In other words, like this is an all-in encounter. He's taking entirely into his own perception. Who is this? What has he just said and done? How has that changed his world? How does that change how Israel might understand itself? These are risks of courage and faith that it's a risk, again, like it was for the leper, it's a risk for the centurion to say this, to imagine making such a public statement when he's a representative of Rome. And then it's an extraordinary thing that Jesus, being able to receive and hear all this, actually then responds to the centurion with this capacity to say, here is a person whose faith needs to be admired from the enemy, who actually can also now lead us in understanding what it is that's really going on in the mission that Jesus is carrying out. He heals the man. And the question then becomes, how do we grow toward becoming enemy lovers? We follow an enemy-loving God. We know that because we're here. Because, as the Apostle Paul says, it was while we were yet enemies that Christ died for us. So we know what it means to have been loved by a God who we have often treated as an enemy. But in this context, Jesus says this person's faith is worth such honor. He heals the man, and it raises for us the question, what do we do with people who are our enemies? We live right now, it just happens that I just had gotten back on Tuesday from being in Hong Kong. And I was teaching at a seminary there. And so for 10 days, I was immersed in Hong Kong life and immersed in the church in Hong Kong, trying to understand what it means to be Hong Kong Christians in a Xi era, and how the ongoing and increasing oppression of the church, restriction of the church, is going to redefine the Hong Kong church in a way that it obviously has long since done in China as a nation, and increasingly done with things that were open. Fuller has an extremely active relationship with seminaries in China. And yet, in the years that I became president, we moved from having the door wide open to being invited by China to come in and do almost anything, to being essentially, with all the other seminaries, being essentially disinvited. Don't come in, we'll call you and don't expect it. And so, in that context, Hong Kong has not been under that restrictive kind. It still isn't under that restrictive. They still don't have a division between registered and house churches, for example. But the point is, they do know what enemies are like. And most of the people I knew would see China as an enemy. And yet they also realize this is their destiny. And you can immigrate, of course, and thousands and thousands and thousands have. But if you're deciding for all kinds of reasons that you're staying, you are now having to come to know and accept and receive China's influence in a way that is, they know, going to completely redefine their life together and how the church might operate. And how are they going to respond to this? And are they going to be filled with virulent anger and rage? Or are they going to somehow come to, quote, love China? That was just an amazing thing to watch, and to watch the ways that people told their stories around their growing, frustrated, disappointed, yes, angry, but also growing capacity to be able to love the enemy that is relentlessly moving toward them and toward the restrictions of various things in their life that will no longer be true. So I'm just wondering, at a time of such social division, political division in the United States, where the divisions are drawn every day, where people starting with my dad's neck veins showing in many, many places all around the world, where there's just an enormous amount of rage and anger. There are things that I can think about that are going on in the world right now that make me apoplectically angry about some decision makers, some political voices, some social influencers who are doing things that I think of, and people inside the church who are doing things that I just think of as being fundamentally destructive, just really, really destructive. How do I come to imitate, to taste in some way, to lean toward a more radical kind of love and a capacity to see the person and a capacity to still retain my own convictions perhaps about something, though those obviously can also be suspect, but to retain my own convictions and yet learn to hold them and relate to the people who are perhaps the enemies, who might not ever be willing to hear the centurion, let alone the centurion's faith, let alone to hear that kind of. So I could go on and on about this, but I think the question becomes, do we know that we follow an enemy loving God, and are we actually willing to practice learning what it means to lean into that kind of loving, which is just not expected by anybody. It's what's expected now is simply gauntlet throwing, where you just take your rage and you throw down your reason for being upset, and you want to just do nothing but walk away or worse. In this context, Jesus is doing something that's just so uncomfortable. It's Rome. This is a Roman authority, a military form of it in this case, a centurion. So what do we do then about places and social patterns that cause us to avoid people because they might stain us? Association, identification, engagement. What do we do about people who may be enemies, who we would just as soon be repelled by and walk away from? I could go on, but time has come to an end, so I need to wrap this up so that we can move on to your table discussions and other things. Courage is at the forefront in my mind of what it means to be a faithful Christian. Humble courage. And then this question of not only how do we express that kind of courage, but how do we take and learn to practice Christian faith as an act of risk that calls us to engage in a world that we might otherwise avoid and simply hide in our own bubble or spurn in a way that is not characteristic of the way that God actually responds to enemies. Thanks be to God. So let me just pause there. And do we go next to groups? Or
Yes.
Yeah. So here are possible ways of engaging in your table. What have you heard today from what I've said about the text? What about Jesus' words and actions are the most uncomfortable to you, and why? What about Jesus' words and actions are the most uncomfortable? And how do you feel motivated to live your faith in light of this text? Okay, so here are some starter questions. If they're helpful, use them. If you think they need to be amended at your table in the usual Berkeley way, feel free. And we'll go from there. Any other questions? Do we just do that?
Yeah, we're just gonna now join your
We'll
group.
take about 15 minutes to go discuss questions that are up here on the board, on our tables, and then may come up with some other questions that we can ask Mark, and he can opine on.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so just take these questions and talk about them.
So, as I understand it, the habit is now to move to Q&A or a conversation together. However you want to do this. So, I open the floor to anyone who might want to make a comment, throw a tomato, quiche, or offer a question. Yes, Doug.
So, like the story of the centurion, what in me was, I never really noticed that he was actually coming because his servant was
Yes,
sick.
right.
And he doesn't even ask.
Right.
He just states it, and then the whole story unfolds from just him.
Yes.
Just the oddness of this, like a guy who would normally send somebody else to go to
Totally,
Jesus, right?
totally, right. Yeah, it is an amazing thing. It is an amazing thing. The question that's just been raised is one about the centurion and the fact that his reason for coming to Jesus was really in service of his servant, or slave probably, who had something that was threatening his life. Yeah, it is an amazing thing, and it's an example to me of the. We can obviously discount it. This is a terrible Jesus discount rate. I think we sometimes read the gospel discounting the Jesus stories on the basis of, well, yeah, but that's Jesus. As opposed to the way that I think Jesus is actually inviting us to the Jesus story, which is, yes, I am Jesus, and ultimately I am the Son of God and the Messiah. That's all true. But in actual fact, so many of the things that he's doing are really quite ordinary realities of how all of us can live. We may or may not have full unhealing capacity in the way that Jesus did. But do we have the capacity to extend our realm of concern beyond ourselves to a slave? In a context like that, a centurion would have had many such slaves that would have been part of their arrangement of life, right? So the fact that he was able to zero in on one particular person, do this very humane gesture at the very least, and then in the end, this miraculous gesture. But along the way, he does all kinds of smaller miraculous gestures, like simply even acknowledging and receiving the centurion, letting his witness of faith be fully heard, caring about his slave for the sake of that exchange, understanding how power goes. I love the way that it's like, to the centurion, it's sort of street talk. Like, no, I understand how power works. You just say the word and it will be done. You don't need to go and do this. That's not the way the Roman authorities would have, the Jewish authorities would have ever talked to Jesus. No one ever says anything remotely like that. But a centurion, a Roman centurion who understands how echelons of leadership and power go, saw that clearly that this is how it works, and Jesus just needs to say the word. So, did you want to make a more specific comment or question, Doug, or was it just drawing attention to that fact?
I mean, who's crossing the boundary of enemies more, Jesus or the centurion?
Yes, right. They're both crossing boundaries, right? Absolutely, right. Yeah, thank you. Yes, Steve.
It occurred to me in your example that when I see somebody behaving in a jerky fashion that I think is incompatible with Christian faith, I don't see Christ in that person anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that blocks that interaction. I believe that Christ is in all of us, and not that we are Christ, we established that earlier. But the fact is that if I don't see Christ in you because of some behavior of yours or some annoying behavior or whatever it is, I'm shutting off a connection that's important.
That's right. That's right. And this is where, these are things that we can really become practiced at doing, right? I mean, there's all kinds of really ordinary actions, which can include things, I'll just offer these as simple things that have been important to me. One has been to try, when I'm in contexts where there's lots of people and where I'm often in line for something, this creates a learning opportunity to try to pay attention. Like, who am I seeing? What am I actually seeing? It's actually an incredible amount of information that's being emitted from all of us at any given moment. Am I prepared to actually perceive that, to receive that, to let them tell me who they are, sometimes by how they're standing or how they're dressing or how they, how they seem to be interacting with whoever might be with them. Like, those give me insights that are just a humanizing insight into somebody or something that I wouldn't otherwise necessarily pay attention. It's like body, and I'm trying to move from body to person, and then not just a person, but person who is reflecting certain really quite specific angles of life experience. Can I move into that humanity and do it as a human being myself? Yeah. Yes.
In encountering my own WASP tendencies,
Yeah.
and especially on culture nowadays,
Yeah.
entitlement and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Being a photographer, it's been a real challenge to get off my judgments and prejudices.
Yes. Right.
Towards anybody.
Right.
And like the Bible says, the eyes are the mirror of the soul.
Yes.
So I've been challenged to train myself to no matter what
Right.
their physical environment, their physical physique looks like,
Right.
all the piercings and all that stuff,
Right.
to look at their eyes
Yes.
and to see the light
Right.
in their eyes.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
it's an imperfect art, but that's been my challenge
Yes.
personally.
I think it was David Brooks who made the comment that there's a very significant difference between asking somebody a question like, why do you hold that opinion, or why are you like this, or why do you have that stance in the world? Instead of asking that, asking, how did you come to be the person with this, whatever particular thing is that you might be hearing about? And that's really an invitation into a story. And what's behind what you're saying is, by looking into the person's eyes, what you're really trying to do is try to figure out, so who really are you? And what is the story behind who you are? And why did it turn out that you have 45 piercings in your left cheek? Like, what happened? That isn't a neutral thing. Nobody comes to that neutrally. There's a whole raft of life experience that causes many, many things to happen. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I'm afraid when I look in that person's eyes, I'm thinking, how in the world did you come to that crazy, idiotic position? I mean, it's hard to get beyond that.
Thanks for sharing. Because all of us understand what it is to feel that and to wonder the same thing. And I do think this is why it's such a great invitation, right? I mean, human relationship is an endless invitation to learning and engagement, right? So instead of positioning, it's learning and engagement. So certainly everyone in the room has had moments of engagement that are like that. But if we cultivate an actual human curiosity as opposed to an assessment, that's a really different arrangement. I didn't have to be put off by somebody's habits and piercings. I don't know I'm talking about piercings so much, but whatever. You know what I'm saying? Just we're put off by one another in a whole variety of ways. But rather than that, what if I just had a curiosity posture? I actually want to understand the world that I'm in. I want to understand different people's experience. That is part of where the courage and the courage to break our own habits, frankly. It's not the courage to encounter the other out there and the difference, but it's actually the courage to actually acknowledge that we are restrained inside our own little prison of self-knowledge. You know, Mark Labberton is Mark Labberton, north, south, east, and west. That just turns out to be a super small box. And I just am less and less interested in that box. I'm fine with it, but I'm not, that's not a life. That's just called a setup. And the question becomes, what do I do with it? And what I want to do with it is at the very least express curiosity in the hope that that curiosity might actually lead to love in some kind of genuine sense. But that means letting go of a lot of stuff along the way. Yeah, Dave.
Mark, I really appreciate your careful study of this. I was just going to say, one of the things that always impresses me about Matthew, my favorite gospel also, is when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain and his disciples, plural, came up and sat down and he taught them.
Right.
And so when it comes to these demands, we shouldn't think of ourselves as just living in our individualistic Western society. But to build that house on the rock, we need some helpers.
That's right.
To keep it on the rock.
That's right.
To recognize the sand,
That's
we
right.
need some helpers.
That's right.
To have the courage to reach out to the unclean,
Yeah.
it helps if there's
That's
some
right.
others, or to the centurion, or whatever it is. And we need each other for discernment, first of all,
Right.
is to figure out what should I do and when.
Yes.
But also, we need each other for support,
Yes.
to go along with us,
Yeah.
to pick us up when we fail.
Yeah.
But I love it.
No,
I'm just thinking we can get so intimidated by thinking I have to do that all by myself, like
Right.
that heroic
Right.
woman from the church who went up
Right,
there.
right. Well, and this is where, well put, David, thank you. And I do think that one of the things that is interesting about the Gospels, as we all know, if we've been studying or reflecting on the Gospels, is how much Jesus interacts with his disciples, not just to teach them, but to really share a communion together in which a lot of the mission that he's trying to display and to encourage is actually unfolding in the context of their own relationships with each other. And certainly it's the case that while I had huge apprehension about becoming part of a collection of people called Christians when I was in college, I also early on began to realize how much I had to learn and how much I had to benefit from understanding the maturity of Christians that were around me in college. It just happened that the college that I was in was a college that had a really strong set of Christian people, and they were of a kind that honestly I'd never met before. I didn't know any people like this, and it over the years has been the case that the transformation in me is very bit a part of the gestation and the purification, the process of change that comes about through community, where other people who are far more experienced and courageous and faithful than I am have given me a glimpse and understanding of what this actually means, and I've tried to draft off of their movement because they often are far, far ahead of me, and as a result, both my own life and our collective life, which is what you're pointing to, is really changed by that. Hugely important. Yeah.
Mark, when you were sharing your story about your experiences in Hong Kong and how the people there are having to come to grips with the reality that inevitably their life is going to be coming under control of forces that they would not necessarily wish, but it's what they have at this time. I wonder if there's any analogy and metaphor between that kind of acceptance ultimately in our lives with the reality that as many of us are aging in place, ultimately we're going to be confronted with medical diagnoses that we would not want, but which we have to deal with. And whether there's a place for God to act, to change our hearts and our attitudes, become more accepting about what lies ahead.
Yeah, it's wisdom, I think, that you're talking about. And what we don't need is an unwise church, which is unfortunately what we seem to have. But the same has been true of Israel, so let's share the bounty of our lack of wisdom. But yes, I mean, and certainly, you know, in a Chinese culture, you're aware that you're talking about people who've been formed by a 4,000-year history, right? So what was especially delicious to me, I guess, about some of the conversations I had was that people were living out of such depth of a frame of reference, unlike an American culture which tends to be more immediate. We tend to be a cut flower society where, roots often are not tended, let alone, multi-generational roots are not attended. And that perspective of being able to have a longer trajectory is part of living life in God, who has, as it were, far more than a 4,000-year history, and whose being is meant to be the ground out of which we live and move and have our existence, including ultimately our mortality. So yes, I completely agree. And how we grow in that is actually something that can happen. These are not like fictional things. This is actually what Christian maturing actually can provide us. My mother-in-law died in January, an amazing woman, Helen Morrison, who was part of First Press during many of the years that we were here. And she died at 95 and had just really about as great a dying as a person could have. She didn't die of any condition or illness. There was nothing about her except wearing out at 95. And so she had her mind, she had her presence, but she also had just this deep abiding faith. So she was just deeply at peace, as able to talk about life and death. This has been true for years and years, but it was true now at the moment of her dying. There was nothing about that had changed. She just was now actually doing the thing that she knew was going to be happening, and it turned out this is how it was going. And not everyone, of course, gets to die under such circumstances. I'm vividly aware of that. But for her, it was just a natural expression of her existence, that she would live, she would die, and she would live again. That sort of rhythmic sense of the future. Remarkable. Other, yes, please.
You talked about courage and risk, and it seems that one of the things that Jesus does is kind of try to re-educate and recalibrate us on fear,
Yes.
tamp down certain fears and elevate other fears.
Yes, that's right.
What's been your kind of experience, or what's been informing you as you think about how we see fear, particularly in terms of the things that we need to kind of tamp down a little bit, and then some of the things that we probably underestimate?
Yeah. Some of you know that I'm working on a book on fear, and one of the things that the book is about has to do with the way that our fears are, of course, instinctual and biological, absolutely profoundly, so deep brain stuff, and at the same time, we have a culture of fear that lives on top of that or out of that, or is applying as a further layer to that. So part of it is how do we educate our fears? And we educate ourselves in so many other ways. Why can't we deliberately, mindfully be aware that we need to educate ourselves about our fears? So just to be very pragmatic about it, I do think that part of it has to do with first just acknowledging the fears that are shaping us. So I would encourage you to perhaps make a list of some of your greatest fears. And if you want to make it exhaustive, make it exhaustive. But if you want to just choose the top 2 or 3 that tend to trigger you the most, just to put those down. And then write a paragraph or 2 about why that fear occupies the concern that it does, and what tends to trigger it so that it gets set off. Because we might be walking with the fear, but usually something or some certain set of things end up being the kinds of things that we tend to avoid. Then ask ourselves, what would it take for me to be able to see that fear in a different way? It is not about nothing. It's never about nothing. So it's not about how do I just deny it, or how do I just try to throw it out of my mind. That's not how to deal with fear. That's like saying, let's not think about pink elephants, and then we end up speaking and thinking about pink elephants the whole day, like getting caught in It's a Small World after all. At Disneyland, where you can't get away from it. No, let's actually totally embrace that this is actually a fear. But what are the factors that make it so triggering to us and feeling so dangerous or threatening to us? And often in that list, there will be things that are really quite manageable, meaning they're things that, well, actually, I really am operating out of ignorance, for one thing. I don't really know what I'm actually fearing. And I don't want to know because that makes me more fearful. This is kind of perfect fear cycle. I'm really, really terrified, but you don't have to be. I know, but I feel really good being terrified because I'm sort of in control by being terrified, right? I don't want to lose my sense of control by having to then look squarely into the vortex of why I'm so afraid. I could give you countless examples. Church-related examples to me are a time at another church in Philadelphia where I was serving for a while, and this guy, we had not said the church had a tradition of saying the Apostles' Creed every week. There was a Sunday that we didn't say the Apostles' Creed, and at the door afterwards, with back to neck veins for some reason, they were vividly showing, and he was screaming at me that he was so angry that we had not said the Apostles' Creed that day. And so, another opportunity to practice seeing this evening. Come to me with your anger, tell me all about it, where does it come from? I said, I too really value saying the Apostles' Creed. So I share that, and I can imagine maybe some of the reasons why this makes you so upset, but I really would like to sit down and have a conversation with you about why you are as distressed about this as you obviously are. So when we eventually had that conversation, which was tricky because at first he wanted to just jump and run, right? He wanted to just announce it to me and then go on with his Sunday. I was a little more meddlesome faster than that, so I said, you can dump, that's fine, I can receive that, but now let's try to unpack this. And what came out of it was this feeling, he said, this is the only way I ever expressed my faith all week, was in that one moment. Now suddenly we're on completely different terrain, right? So actually we've taken away your one expression of your own faith. Maybe we could talk about that. Why is it that that's the only thing that you do that expresses your faith? Do you want to find other ways of expressing your faith? What are the risks of that? Because you clearly thought there were risks. I'm only getting at this in this way to just say, it often really does come down to things that we can sort of gradually dismantle, reorganize, inform, not for the sake of covering over, but for the sake of actually diffusing why certain things are so triggering. So this is why I think people who have near-death experiences are often people that are very free, because there is some sense that they have faced that ultimate moment where they have had an experience that they are dying, and whatever their post-death experience might be, they have died, or as it were, nearly died. So they come back from that with like, okay, yeah, now I've actually been inside the beast, and it just turns out I'm not terrified by that. And now I'm going to live with a greater degree of freedom because I've actually literally faced my worst fear. So I think one of the benefits of being a pastor for me has been being at the bedside of hundreds of people in their last minutes or last hours. And it's meant that I've seen death up close. And I've had some serious health things, not life-threatening, but serious health things along the way as well. And then I've had a family with a lot of older relatives who I've just watched progressively die over many years since I was a little boy. So as a result, my sense of death is really recalibrated by all of those experiences. And I don't think I won't know until my death is imminent, but I don't think that I'm carrying the anxiety that I would have carried otherwise, because I simply didn't even know what that was like. There's ways of overcoming this, actually, by being close, stepping toward people who are dying, not stepping away from them. But most people's experience is that most people step away when it becomes clear that you're about to die. Sometimes we can use the euphemism of sort of social appropriateness and all that. But sometimes it's just like, it freaks me out to be with the person who's dying. Well, actually, it might be really good then to be with some people who are dying. In whatever capacity you can, to be present with that, no answers, no need to like perform tricks. They're dying. You can talk to them about their dying. You can name these things, or racially, for example. I was in a situation not long ago with someone who had a responsibility in this organization that I was connected to, and they were trying to describe someone without identifying them as black. And I said, it feels like you're trying to avoid naming that. Is that true? He said, well, yeah, it is true. I said, well, why does it make you nervous to name what they know as a lived experience is their daily life? You don't have to tell them they're black. they know in every way that they are black, and they understand the stigma that for some people is attached to that. Why would you move away from them by not creating a space where you can just know them for who they really are, which includes their race or racial, ethnic, social identity, in a way that you can be at peace in that person's presence? And Farnola, of course, a whole narrative of why she built up this kind of anxiety. And over time, hopefully that will be overcome. But that's an example of like a fear of even a word, not just a social reality, but like the use of a word. And these things are really what I've come to think of it as the tyrannous fears, as opposed to the essential fears. There are essential fears that keep us alive that are really, really important every single day that we would never want to diminish. We want to highlight and refine and engage. But there's tyrannous fears like that are just built out of social anxiety that have nothing to do with another person's race, that have nothing to do with our difference in social location. They just have to do with the difference in social location, which actually turns out to be a construct, which we can actually turn out to be able to understand and engage in a really different way. And it just takes time and intentionality around that to be able to overcome some of those things, and to find in it the great freedom from fear that can otherwise be actually quite crippling. So I just think that there's lots of opportunities to practice this every single day. Tom?
So one of the things about our culture as well as Jesus is that there's overwhelming need.
Yes.
Jesus did a nice thing. He healed a leper and he healed this servant. Can you talk about how Matthew might suggest Jesus lives out of a sense of love and not out of a sense of guilt?
Right.
I mean, he could have done so much more.
Yes.
Maybe,
yes.
In terms of healing all the lepers.
Yes. Right.
And we, I think, have to somehow figure out what we can do and what we can't do.
Yeah.
And how did Jesus figure out, okay, I can do this, but I can't do this?
Yeah, really great question, Tom. Well, one of the things that I think is important from my point of view is to just follow to the backdrop of our human existence is this tendency, as I shared a couple of weeks ago, this tendency to want to be God, and therefore to hold all things. And we still can't easily come to terms with the fact that that's just not true. It's not going to be true, that we don't really hold all things, that we are finite, and that we are fallen. And that those are givens in the world. And Jesus has neither of those two problems. I mean, I suppose finitude is a more nuanced answer since he does die. But certainly his fallenness is not our condition. So behind all of this is this sense of if I can't do everything, I can't do anything. So that if I do the first thing, then it's going to set a precedent, and then it's going to consume me, and then I'm going to be overwhelmed, and I can't stand the thought of being overwhelmed, so therefore I'm not going to take the first step because I just feel undone by it. Those are all understandable actions of a finite creature who has the capacity of imagination and potentially of compassion to want to extend ourselves right beyond the bounds of our own humanity. And then we end up doing these things out of a sense of obligation, not out of a sense of love, and not out of a sense of freedom. So I do think if you read carefully through Matthew, the rest of the Gospels as well, but certainly in Matthew, you have this very strong sense that Jesus is, the whole book is really about the way that Jesus redefines love and its capacities to be able to extend ourselves into relationships, people, circumstances that we might find otherwise paralyzing or impossible or oppressive and only bound by duty and obligation and not bound by love. So the freedom that he demonstrates, this is the thing that I think most recently has been the most striking feature to me of Jesus in Matthew, is his utter freedom. Like he knows all the boundaries that exist, all the places of defense, all the ways that he could offend Rome or that he could offend Israel and the scribes and Pharisees, all that's there, totally aware of all that, and then just walks in freedom out of a different key, out of a different orientation, There's times, as we see, where he does things that are very respectful of a boundary, and there's other times when he just considers the boundary not relevant to whatever the circumstances. And it certainly comes down into people and all the very specific ways that love, rather than obligation or duty or the weight of it all. This is why I guess this literature that I've spoken about again a couple weeks ago is in my mind again this morning, in light of what we're talking about, is this sense of just being really clear that we're quite knowledgeable and free about being finite. Like that's just a really, really quite wonderful thing. We get to do our lives as mortals, not as anything other than mortals. And we get to do our life as fallen mortals, whose tendencies are to be bent in on ourselves. And instead, Jesus can actually give us the capacity to be freer and freer from ourselves, not in any inappropriate self-denying, self-negating way, but in a sense of self-offering, self-giving. I'm free to live in spaces where identifying with a person who might stain me or listening carefully and honoring a person who might be an enemy is a really, really possible thing. And if I'm free, it's not possible if I'm not free. If I'm bound, then there's no way that I'm going to even want to or even consider the idea of doing some of these things. So I just want to be free. I think that's what the trajectory of the kingdom life is really about. It's not bound by the small making of our own tendencies, our own humanity, our own pettiness, our own narrow vision. So how do we explode those boundaries? How do we honor and have knowledge of them, but also just learn to walk in the freedom of what is ultimately the freedom of law? Other comments or questions? Of course it's easier to talk about these things than to do them. And so that just matters to me to say that. So it's not like I'm now saying this because I've achieved these things. I'm saying these things because I am convinced that these are the center things that Jesus is really about. One would wish that they're the central things that the church is known for, right? Oh, that we were known for being a community of such extraordinary capacity to listen, to receive, to forgive, to nurture, to support, to encourage, to heal. And obviously the rap on the street these days couldn't be farther from most of those things. So having said that, I just want to also give the narrative that in most places, in most cities and various states where these studies have been done, by far the largest number of people who are voluntarily engaging in social good as volunteers are Christian people. Overwhelmingly, a far larger army in every state than you would find of people who are just civic volunteers. That's not trying to create a hierarchy of good people and bad people. It's just to say that's tangible evidence of people actually showing up and doing things in their cities, towns, neighborhoods, etc., that actually really do make a very significant impact. And they do arise out of a Christian mindfulness, culture, way of being that could really have a long-standing, and do have a long-standing impact. This is where the social welfare that we can ourselves contribute to in small and in informal ways can actually really matter, as well as the out-of-the-box ways that just come like with the jerk in the Burger King line. Who just turns out, yeah, he's a cretin, but he's a human cretin, and he really has a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And there's a whole gigantic narrative about that, which I can't take responsibility for. I could do a few small things, but I could at least receive him as a full person as we sat on the moving sidewalk, right? These are small human-scaled things that don't change his life and don't undo his narrative, but I do believe actually matter in the world. And this is where Ann Snyder Snyder Brooks and David Brooks have both been engaged in a long project which they call the Weavers, finding people who are social weavers, who are simply weaving into any and every kind of social context you need, the weaving of the grace and love and mercy and justice of God that are just built into the environment, so that among all the troubles, there is also this relentless weaving of loving people, doing loving things in contexts where that really turns out to matter in the long haul and in the big picture. So let me close this with a word of prayer. Oh God, how grateful we are for the gift of Christian fellowship, and that we're on a journey where we can really actually grow increasingly into the likeness of Jesus, not by some management approach or technique, but by simply trying to practice living into your example, to do the smallest of small things. Thank you, oh God, for Pascal's comment, we should do great things as if they're small because of Jesus Christ. And we should do small things as if they're great because of Jesus Christ. May we have the courage and the willingness to take risks that will live into this kind of faith that can be and is part of the yeast of the kingdom of God. Bless us, we pray. Amen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Your leadership team just wants you to remember that we take a summer hiatus. So if you want to go home and you're a calendar person, put the 3rd Saturday of September on your calendar, and that's when men's breakfast will reappear. Anyway, Michael Farnola really would love to be able to have your contact information to make sure that you stay in the loop, and Steve Hawkins too. So if you could check to make sure you got your email and your phone number, that would be great. Okay? Go.
And we may have some activities this summer, like possibly a fishing trip, other things that are going on. So please stay in touch, and we'll see you in the fall.